Hello, everyone. So thank you very much for being a part of this masterclass. And so I'm Marina Galvadao. I'm the founder and executive director of UBA Sustainability Institute. So we develop projects. So we'll be bringing a little bit of a, let's say, a project developer perspective to this masterclass. Just to give a little bit of perspective, so to understand what is exactly carbon credit mechanism and where do they come from. Actually, the very beginning of it started at was when actually the UNFCCC, so United Nations Convention on Climate Change, was created. Actually, it was in 1992. And then it was created the Kyoto Protocol that actually, after the ratification of 180 countries, they actually so pledged to reduce the emissions. Sorry, it's actually 150 countries that were signatory of the Kyoto Protocol. So when the industrialized countries, they pledged to reduce their emissions, the idea was to have market mechanisms that actually allowed the people to trade carbon. In the very beginning, there was only two flexibility mechanisms that actually included only the rich country, let's say. And then it was the third mechanism was created that was called this clean development mechanism. And that were the only place where developing countries could actually develop initiatives that could trade within the global targets of the UNFCCC. Forests and land use were always something very controversial because most of the countries were the developing countries had their forests and also like agricultural activities. So the CDM at that time allowed it for the rich countries to compensate through these projects in developing countries a maximum of 1% of their overall target. During the first commitment period, a lot of activities were excluded, notably everything that was related to forests and for example, afforestation and reforestation. Sorry, they came later on in 2001 as a possibility. So meanwhile, like the official arena of the UNFCCC was being created, the voluntary carbon markets started to be more dynamic because it was a demand from private actors, and when I say private, it's also civil society, to develop projects and either enter in this official mechanism of the CDM or do the trading to get funds to finance those activities. So it's just to give you a perspective that the voluntary carbon markets, it's an emanation, so it's a fruit of the UNFCCC as well. But at the end, it gained life of its own because it was an answer to the lengthy process of negotiations and approval, sorry, of the methodologies and so on. So actually, what actually is a carbon credit? It's a fruit, so it's a result of a certification mechanism where it could be companies, governments that they need to reduce their emissions, and they invest by purchasing such certificates in the market. It can be directly as well. It can be a B2B process. So it doesn't have to be necessarily a tripartite, or I'm going to explain this later. And the idea is that the activities that can fit the carbon standard, so that they are the jargon that we use is that we say that they are eligible. When you have activities that are eligible, you can do the certification and generate those certificates that are then paid back as carbon offsets for those companies in the rich world. The carbon credit mechanism at the beginning was used in terms of the view of climate solidarity, or the fact that the rich countries should pay the transition in other countries, but also was through the joint implementation mechanism was possible to take place in for example, in Europe, where there is emission trading schemes and so on. So when we say carbon credit, it can be, they may have different names depending on the markets and the registries, but the process is a bit it's similar in the sense that we quantify greenhouse gases, we have to certify them, and then we will generate a unit that it can be, for example, in the regulatory system of Europe, it will be an allowance, but in a project that it's in the developing countries, if you're registry under a specific standard, it will be a VCU, under the Clean Development Mechanism, it will be a CER. So it's a different units, but they are all carbon credits. We can pass. I cannot actually, I don't have, oh, thank you. So just to explain you, actually the cornerstone is the project developers, because it's they will facilitate and connect all the dots. So we start, for example, a project developer, if you have activities on the ground, let's take a very tangible example, that is planting trees. You assess what are the different standards that you can apply, and those standards, to answer one of the questions that were put in the chat, is that each standard has its own methodologies. Some of them, most of them actually use also CDM methodologies, so the Clean Development Mechanism, and therefore the methodologies that were approved under the UNFCCC. So all the standards have their specific rules and methodologies. So when you have an activity, you have to go through those rules and see which standard actually fits better to your project. We mention here a few. For example, what is one of the biggest for forestry and forest restoration is Vera. Previously the name was VCS. Now they changed to Vera. That it's now an umbrella because it gathers a lot of different standards. For example, CCB, which is Climate, Community and Biodiversity, is under Vera as well. We have other standards like Plan Vivo, that it's a more like small scale standard. We have Social Carbon, which is a Brazilian registry and a quality standard. We have Gold Standard, that is an European standard that is also, for example, if you're doing cook stoves activities, so everything that is related to energy efficiency, renewables, as for Vera as well, you have all these type of methodologies. You have Biocarbon Registry, that it's also Latin America. Cert Carbono is Colombian, that it's now being also developed in other countries. So those standards, they actually are registry standards, and sometimes they also have a quality aspect. By that we mean like assessing in details the co-benefits of the projects. We also have WOCAN, that is a woman standard, so it's pretty much focused on gender aspects. So the idea is that when you have a project, you will look at those standards, you will look at the methodologies, and you have to do the validation first and then the verification. Either you have your credits and you trade them directly with the end buyers, either you can go through brokers, traders, and retailers. So every time you have an issuance, that is the emission of those credits, you have a transaction that it's offsets that will go to the end buyer. I think that's it for this slide. There are some key criteria that actually apply pretty much for all the standards, is that the projects, when we are developing them, they must be eligible. That is, there are specific rules. For example, where you will be planting trees, it cannot be deforested like 10 years ago. At least it has to be deforested at least 10 years ago. This is to avoid people that will be cutting trees and then planting trees to have carbon credits. So this kind of criteria, it's really important to see if your project actually fits those criteria. They have to be additional. Additionality is one of the key elements for a carbon project as well. Additionality means that you're doing something, like the activities that you're implementing, they are really additional in the sense that it's not the business as usual. So, for example, if everybody's installing solar panels, your activity doesn't need actually carbon finance. However, if nobody's installing solar panels or planting trees, and actually the choice that would be more profitable or with less legal and social acceptance, then your activity is additional. So in the sense that you're facing a lot of barriers, and that's why carbon finance was developed in order to overcome those barriers. You have to demonstrate that your assumptions are conservative. This is also a very important point. They have to be real and permanent. That is real in the sense that they are tangible and they can be measured. And permanent in the sense that you're conserving as much as you can, that emission will, for example, if we take again the example of tree planting, it will be something that it will be kept, like at least for the crediting period, that it could be like 30 years. You also have to demonstrate that you're avoiding double counting. So Lucy and Lucio were explaining like the different, like the top down, let's say the REDD+ approach, and sometimes this can be entered into national inventories. So you have to see whether your action where it's taking place is being accounted elsewhere. If it is, you cannot have double counting because it wouldn't be fair, right? You also have to prove that you're complying with all the standards, rules, and requirements. You have to demonstrate that they're in line with national regulations, that you're not like doing something that it's harmful, either for the environment, but also for the population. It has to be accepted, and this is very important, by the involved communities. For REDD+, for example, we have specific requirements and safeguards when we're talking about communities, indigenous and traditional communities. And this should be something that it must be respected in every project. The projects have to be audited by accredited third parties. It's what we call validation verification bodies. In the CDM, so the Clean Development Mechanism, they were named DEOs, so it was designated operational entities, but actually it's like TÜV Süd, Bureau Veritas, EPIC, Earthwood, and other third parties that will come and see whether what you're saying that you're doing is actually happening on the ground, and will be communicating with the standards so that you actually have your certification process ongoing. So for a project, you have to go through a certification process. It's important to stress out that this is not like a simple process. Carbon finance has the advantage of structuring interventions on the ground, because you have to have procedures, you have to have a robust monitoring, and you have to follow all these plans that you be going like for the number of years that you expected, that you estimated. So what I'm trying to say here is that it is a certification process, and it takes effort to do the monitoring, for instance, and also the implementation, following rules that will respect social and environmental aspects. So also it is important to, so when you're developing a project, you be registering under a specific standard, and then they have their own registries, and then you have also third parties. So that's why I said the project developer is the cornerstone, because you'll be articulating with all those institutions. And just also to clarify, like the REDD+ mechanism versus a carbon credit mechanism, it is important for you to see that there are three pathways. So REDD+ can be a national initiative, regional, or project-based. So the example that Lucio mentioned is mostly national or regional. Now we are having some hybrid situations, as Lucio explained. For example, now there are the Leaf Coalition with our trees, and so this is a kind of when we talk about jurisdictions, it's about a regional initiative within a country that is doing this this process of having a certification by not a governmental body. It would be a standard, a private standard, as we would do with a voluntary project. So individual projects, they can be part of a national REDD+, or they can be a standalone initiatives in the voluntary market. What is important to stress out is that if you're developing a REDD+, and I will explain a little bit further, but REDD+ means conservation of standing forest and some restoration. You can also have a restoration component within a REDD+. So if you're doing that, you have to follow, for example, if your government did the FREL, so the forest reference emissions level, you have to align with that unless you have tier 3 data, that is the data from the field, from your exact area that you're working, so inventories and so on. But if you don't have, you have to align with the national government recommendations and sequestration rates and deforestation rates as well. And this is for this slide. In order just for you to have an idea of what are the scopes. So Lucy already brought this up, but I would just explain from a carbon development perspective. The forest conservation activities, it's actually, as I said, keeping trees standing. So it could be preservation, management, maintenance of forest itself, peatland and mangroves, for example. So wetlands and tidal wetlands. The REDD+ can also include, again, reforestation, but the main activity is to keep standing trees. So keep pristine forest or secondary forest. The restoration can be planting and supporting the growth of trees. For example, full plantings with saplings. It can be nucleus restoration, like you just select spots where you're going to do the plantings or reinforcement of natural regeneration. You can have agroforestry, and you can also have silvopasture. It can be in terrestrial wetlands. Another activity that actually fits here as well is assisted natural regeneration, that is avoiding degradation factors and supporting and taking away all the drivers of degradation. For example, preventing fire, fencing areas, and so on. There are also other activities related to agriculture that we call agricultural sustainable practice, that it can be, for example, reducing nitrogen fertilizers in agricultural lands or grasslands, and also increasing, the main target being to increase soil organic carbon. Another category is the improved forestry management. So it is activities that actually reduce and increase carbon stocks with forests and reduce GHG emissions when compared to the business as usual. It's actually the management of, for example, standing trees that we'll be showing in the next slide. What that actually means. So from IPCC, actually, IPCC, for those that don't know, is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. It's the main reference for us when we're developing everything related to climate, the scientific board. Their view on the carbon accounting is that if we start, for example, you see this line, the white line that is called the forest definition. This is one of the key elements as well. When you are doing a restoration or conservation projects, you have to see what is the actual forest definition of your country. So, for example, countries that say the trees should be high, have a height of 2 meters, of I don't know how many percentage of cover, and a minimum of hectares. So this is your let's say your baseline. This is what actually it's either your target if you're willing to implement a forest, or this is what you're willing to conserve if you're doing your REDD+. So let's take, for instance, the first example here of intact forest. You have a carbon sink here, and then you're going to keep it. So that's why throughout time, you're going to keep that stock, right? A forest management would be a little bit different, because you cut trees, but you conserve a certain level of zinc, so of carbon stocks, and then the trees will grow again, and then you cut again to extract. It can be wood or other products, and then again you have this effect, but you're always keeping the level of your stocks. Forest degradation is when you, because of different drivers, it will be degrading your carbon stock, right? So forest degradation is still one of the biggest challenges for every forestry project, because from a remote sensing perspective, is very hard. Now we have new technology since last year's, but historically it's very hard to assess degradation, because sometimes, for example, people can be chopping a little bit of wood here and there, and then from a satellite imagery, you don't see that. So it's very hard to assess using remote sensing. And of course, it requires more studies on the ground to demonstrate that. But just for you to know that, for example, a forest degradation, it's a phenomenon that will go little by little. And when we're talking about deforestation, it's when there is a clear cut. So it's easier to quantify. So take, for instance, you had this intact forest and then it was deforested, and you're getting below this level of the forest definition, and your stocks are really being reduced. So the activities that you can do on non-forest land, so what is actually considered non-forest land according to IPCC is areas that do not comply with the forest definition, is the fact that you, for example, you're going to have a cropland that you will just include annuals, and in most of the time the area will be with their very limited biomass. And you're going to get to a point where you have grasslands or wetland settlement. So this is where the stocks can be very low. We actually here, there's an exception, for example, related to mangroves and so on, because actually mangroves are known for having a lot of carbon in soil, but it's still, this is mostly if we're looking at above ground biomass. And then you can have a process of revegetation. So that is letting new plants coming in to achieve the forest definition. And so that's where we get to forest land again. And we have this only through afforestation and reforestation and revegetation. Okay. And then you can have sometimes you can have the management of for wood, or for example for agroforestry, you can cut down trees, but the idea is to get this stock increasing to get again in the intact or forest management situation. To explain a little bit about the project cycle, so carbon finance, again, it's a certification process. So you have your concept, you have the project design, and then the first step is that you have the registration under the specific standard that you've chose that is more appropriate to your project. And you have the validation, which is the first audit, let's say, saying, okay, everything you're saying you're doing, you're going to do, it's valid, it's eligible, and it comply with the rules. So the project is validated. This will count, for example, it depends, like the number of years that you can engage. It can be from 20 to 100 years. It depends of the project type. For energy projects, it can be less, for energy efficiency as well. But for forestry, it's at least 20 years. And then you can get, like, there are REDD+ projects that go up to 100 years. So when you start after the validation, the project activities can be started, or you can even start during the validation process, actually. And you have the cycles of monitoring and verification. Every time you finalize a verification, which is an audit, you have the issuance of carbon credits. So that's only when you have the carbon credits. And this can go like for forestries, often for restoration and reforestation, it's often a cycle of 5 years, because you have to wait for the trees to grow, and you have to, since there is a cost of bringing the auditors and so on, the idea is that you couple those, and you just, like, it's like the cost benefit of making the auditors coming in and so on. There's not a minimum of hectares actually, but it actually what will define the minimum is your cost of doing the certification. Just to answer to the question here that I see. So those cycles of, for example, for Red Plus is also important to stress out that depending on the area, the verifications can be each year. So the project cycle, the monitoring cycle will be depending on the on this or the specific project type. Sorry. I think that we can go to the next. Oh, yeah, this is the example of project that we have from UBA. So we have a project that's called Jussara, and it's a project of agroforestry and social justice. So we're implementing agroforestry activities with cocoa plantings in the region of Bahia by using also threatened species. And the idea is that we are doing both income generation and restoration of lands. The main target is to reach 1,000 hectares. I think we can move, please. So this is just for you to see, this is a forest structure, cocoa planting in a shadowed system in Brazil that's called Cabruca. So the idea is to recover those areas and also to implement more, so to reach 1,000 hectares. The last one. The idea is so to have the impact in terms of how we can communicate on the impact. So the idea is that we are working with 171 families for the first phase. These kind of activities that the crossword of adaptation and mitigation. And we expect to have 500,000 tons of CO2 over the whole program, that it's actually 30 during 30 years. And the idea is to contribute with food security and supporting subsistence of families and commercialization purpose to generate income, applying the principles of syntropic agroforestry, biodiversity, successional management, and biological fertilization. Including fruit trees, nuts, and emblematic products as cocoa, high diversity of native trees, and also a palm tree that is threatened of extinction. And this is in an area that actually has a biome that is historically threatened by deforestation. So in Brazil, it's the Atlantic forest. It's a hotspot, and only 7% of its original cover. I think we can go to the next slide. Some key Jargon-buster, actually, it's the again, like additionality is one of the key points. It's actually to demonstrate that this is a result would not have occurred without, in the absence of the project itself, what we call the project activities, and that this is not like the business as usual. There are not specific policies subsidized or so on that actually are helping those activities to see the day. ARR is afforestation, reforestation, and revegetation. IFM is improved forest management that actually increase forest carbon stock and or reduce GHG emission from forestry activities. VVB is validation verification bodies. Climate neutrality is an objective that economic actors define to quantify, reduce, and compensate GHG emissions with a certain perimeter and defined time frame. And net zero is an expression that makes reference to the fact of canceling the GHG emissions versus sequestration and capture. I think I just didn't answer a question regarding the prices. So how the prices are established during the voluntary carbon markets. The idea is that there are now market indexes way more than before. For example, the clean development mechanism they had, it was only the only one indexed, but for a long time voluntary carbon markets were negotiated like a B2B or over the counter. Now we have different indexes that we can refer to, for example, CBL, NGO, OP, Strove, A Carbon, and so on. So those index can help you to know what is the market price. But you must pay attention that there is a difference in between the cost per ton and the price. Because, for example, if you're negotiating with a donor, sponsor, or an investor that will be purchasing credits forward, that is doing agreements with you for you to give you money to actually implement those projects, it might be that your reference should not be market price. It could be only the cost of generating each ton. So this is also too important to have in mind. Maybe just to see if I missed any questions here about so the consensus of different methodologies, this I mentioned to you, the credibility of different standards. Actually, the standards are overseen by there is an organization, I forgot the acronym now, it's like the international, it's the same that from ISO, but you have to choose the standard that best fits your project. And all of them now, because the carbon markets are in a very dynamic period, they're restructuring themselves as well to comply with the demand, the increased demanding projects. So no one expected that big movement in the last years. So I think that it's in terms of the credibility, you have to see what are actually the standards that have more market appeal, if you're willing to have more like a tradable unit, or if you want to target a more maybe a smaller standard, but maybe easier to implement. In the sense, when I say easier, it's not easier in the requirements, but easier because the time frame of the other standards can be quite bigger. Yeah, I'm sorry, I just jumped into the questions. Maybe I don't know
That's okay,
what.
Marina. Thank you. Thank you very much for a very clear overview of a very complex topic. But yeah, you've triggered a lot
Thank
of
you.
interest in those different mechanisms. There are a few questions maybe to still highlight, and I think you've partially answered us throughout your presentation, but maybe just to insist a little bit on that. So I think there were quite a few questions about the credibility of the different standards. I mean, you can see that there are a lot of different standards. So how can a specific organization actually choose between those different standards? How can we assess their credibility? Who is actually overseeing the standards? And yeah, in a sense, would like a credit from Vera, Gold Standards, Plan Vivo, and others be valued the same? How should we navigate those multiple standards?
Yeah, so the more what we see more often is it's Vera for forestry. We also have there is also Gold Standard and Plan Vivo, to a very limited extent, but the biggest one that has the more market outreach is Vera. However, this is being changed. That's why I also added the other logos of other standards, is that because it is being, the demand is really big. So it's good to have all the other standards as well, because otherwise it becomes a bottleneck for a project developer to only have one choice or two choices of standard. In terms of credibility, it's good to see, for example, if you're discussing with an investor, or you could have actually this discussion about what are the actual the acceptance of specific standards. Historically, we even had ISO just standard for the quantification. So if you're following a protocol that it's recognized, they use proxies that are recognized internationally from the JG protocol and so on. It should be fine, actually. It's just that if your project is huge and you have a lot of tons, you rather go through a process of having a big, a standard that is really recognized, where you have to sell those units. But if your project is small, you have to think twice, because it is, I'm seeing that there are also questions in terms of costs. It depends a lot of the project, the certification costs, but you have to estimate from $150,000 to $250,000 only for the cost of certification, and have the auditors and doing the paperwork and so on. So that's why this is a kind of a limit for small projects. However, it really depends if you're having funding to do those process or not. Yes, I wouldn't like to make an advertisement of any standards, and because the standards, they actually, for them to exist, they have to comply with a lot of different rules. The only one that is specific to a country, I think, is Ser Carbono. But Latin America, because of the size of the projects and the huge number of tons that are coming out from Latin America, there has also been a movement to create specific standards within the region, to have a more like a South based organizations that also have a standards, because otherwise we are also always relying on, let's say, reach based countries standards, which and sometimes it doesn't make any sense to be concentrating these registries in those countries. So I think to answer very quickly, it's a matter of also to see what are the costs and compare the cost between the standards. There is the issuance cost that is always, for example, every time we emit a ton, you pay for a fee. So depending on the standard, they will have different costs. So this is an analysis of each specific to each standard. And also, I think, for example, if your project have a specific outcomes in terms of co-benefits, you can also target standards that will be more representative of those co-benefits, and not only about the carbon and the GHG accountability.
Thank you, Marina. So I think just to sum up, so there is no oversight body that will certify the credibility of different standards, but a good assessment is to look at the market acceptance of those different standards, and to, if possible, work with the final off-taker of your project to make sure they are comfortable with the standard that is being used. Maybe one last final question that would be to look at how voluntary carbon markets actually align or overlap with the compliance market and the NDCs. So I think that's maybe a question for either Marina or Lucio on how Article 6 actually provides room for the trading of voluntary carbon credits. And maybe
Yes.
Marina, you can start. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Go ahead,
please, Marina, go ahead.
No, Lucy, please.
No, there is not well defined. There are some rules to be agreed, but all the sectors are potentially be source of international trade mitigation outcomes. So that is the kind of unit that is used under the Article 6.2 that is called the ITMOS. And it depends of it is a more flexible mechanism because it depends of the agreement of two parties to exchange or to receive outcomes from the other party to meet the NDC goal of the other one. So the land use and land use change sector and forestry could be one of the sector. The standard or the framework to measure the results is a thing that could be agreed by the both parties that are interested in that part. So they could agree to use the Warsaw framework, for example. Si we are talking on RED Plus, they could agree to use one of the standards that apply for jurisdictional or national level as a requirements to demonstrate the results of the party that will be supplier of these emission reductions. On 6.4 methodologies, this is a mechanism that is led by an executive board of the UNFCCC. And first of all, methodologies has to be approved similarly as it happened with the CDM in the Kyoto Protocol framework, and it is supposed that maybe it will take more time until the methodologies are in place to allow countries to exchange this kind of mitigation results.
Thank you very much, Lucio. So yeah, I hope we have answered most of your questions. My colleague Derek has just shared a list of links and resources for you to dig further into the material presented today. If you have any unanswered question, please feel free also to reach out to us, and we can look with the panelists today to answer those questions. Yeah. So maybe just to wrap up, being conscious of time, I think a few key points to underline from today's discussion is that result-based payment is not a new concept, but it is a necessary framework, necessary tool, basically to link agreed result framework with third-party verification to provide assurance and credibility to landscape restoration projects. So the benefit of having such mechanism is basically to provide aligned incentive to support landscape restoration at scale, to crowd in new actors and attract private finance, support adaptive management, increase accountability of interventions at landscape level, and to improve the financial viability and durability of interventions. What's interesting as well is to see that result-based payments are a way also to accelerate funding, to leverage new funding from private and public sources alike, and that is not limited to tree planting, but there are actually a lot of activities that are eligible for result-based payments, including conservation, restoration, sustainable practices, and improved forest management. And again, result-based payment is not an end in itself; it's a means to an end, and it's part of a wider landscape approach and aims to basically bring the necessary resources to incentivize different actors to join forces and to work together towards sustainable management practices and common objectives at landscape level. Just to also provide a quick summary of what the panelists have mentioned is that in relation to RADD+, so a lot of mechanisms have been developed, and we're looking now at moving from pilots to scaling up support for NDCs through the GCF phase 2, new initiatives like LEAFs and so on. So there is a lot more coming. There is also a rapidly increasing demand from voluntary carbon trading, a lot of different standards to choose from, but again, to help you navigate between those different standards, there are different considerations to take when making that choice. First, to look at the type of projects you're looking at, the scale, the cost of certification and development, but also to look at market acceptability and to try as much as possible to work with the partners and off-takers to agree on a specific mechanism and methodology for the project. So yes, thanks a lot to everyone and to our panelists for providing very clear guidance on those very complicated topics. Again, we're going to have another session on Thursday, and please bear with us because that will be a great opportunity to get first-hand feedback and guidance also from the main players of climate finance. So we have confirmation from a few, including Green and GCF. So please stay with us and don't forget to register for the Thursday session. Before we close, maybe I will just ask if there is one final comment or key points to put across from either one of your panelists. Maybe started from Lucy, if you have any final message or thought for the participants today.
Just that results-based payments can be a very innovative way to finance specific activities in your landscape and to really get private financing get invested and engaged with the landscape.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Lucio, anything to add? Yes, just to highlight that this is a process that will going everyone to ensure an environmental integrity process and the accountability of the emission reductions, looking for more alignment between international and national policy And one of the results of this process will be maybe that projects will be vested in the national accountabilities of countries in a number of years when countries have finalized all the readiness phase to implement the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Lucio. And Marina, you will have the last word.
Yes, so I would like just to thank you for the opportunity of trying to explain a little bit the carbon finance mechanism that I know that it's quite complex, and to say that itself, it can have, sometimes we can have a lot of criticism about this mechanism, but it's the only one we have for private actors and civil society to get funding for climate friendly actions. So I would just like to say that even though it seems complex and can be quite expensive, I think the fact that there are new standards coming up and then there are more people, more practitioners, I really have the hopes that we will be making viable like a small scale projects that can afterwards be scale up. Because I know that it's not easy to start already with a huge project and but just a very good, I think it's a good momentum. Thank you all.
Thank you, Marina. Indeed, a lot of exciting development in that area. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Lucy, sorry, you had the last word?
No, just thank you, Marina.
Yeah. Yes, thanks everyone, and it was great also to see so much interest from the participants. So thanks everyone for making today a positive experience for everyone and to share so much knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.